First of all, global climate change is potentially an enormous problem. Secondly, we don't know enough about the mechanisms of global climate change. Third, if we wait until we know everything we need to know about global climate change, it'll probably be too late. Therefore, what we ought to do is find actions that will help forestall the threat of global climate change, but also can justify themselves for other reasons. That's, I think, what we've been talking about. Now, SPP, I submit, can encourage diverse forces and interests to converge. And I'm less skeptical than Andrew Alesi about the role of some types of civic action if SPP and the North American Energy Working Group can be used as a deliberate tool. Now, just a final word, I'm going to come in under time, about my other intervention, nuclear power. Nuclear power is not going to go away. The hydro dams in Canada are not going to go away. Nuclear power can do far more, far faster than any combination of renewable energy sources to meet targets for global warming gas reductions. Canada, the United States, and Mexico are all seriously considering a revival, an incentivized revival of nuclear power. I go back to David Levy's remark yesterday about diesel fuel. He said, what American would buy a diesel auto? They remember diesels from the 1970s. What about nuclear reactor systems? I would urge you not to think about nuclear technology of the 1970s or the economics of the 1970s. If you think nuclear technology today is the same as it was 30 years ago, you have some homework to do. But I'm not here to lobby for nuclear power or for natural gas or Canadian hydro or for oil sands. Incidentally, oil sands using the in situ techniques can be far more environmentally acceptable than the original open pit techniques that depended heavily on external heat sources. In conclusion, I'm inviting you to examine new technologies, including those that involve reductions in primary energy inputs. And I'm asking you to examine the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America as a mechanism. Without you, particularly after the Mexican election of July 2nd, if AMLO happens to win, SPP could just be rhetoric. But I call your attention to all those forces in Mexico that aren't going to let Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador have a free hand any more than they allowed Vicente Fox to have a free hand in doing what he wanted to do, which probably would have made a lot more sense. Without you, the Security and Prosperity Partnership will just be rhetoric and it will pass away. But you can help to shape it and to nurture it, because in respect to global climate change, you and the various groups and individuals you represent are SPP stakeholders.
Thank you, Joe. Kind of wrapped up the panel and the 2 days. So we have time for questions, and I'm sure they're what Joe brought up in the back here.
Catherine Sygrover from American University. I wanted to ask particularly Michelle and Simone, since both of your research has great connections to my own. And in the interest of full disclosure, I've recently retired, quote unquote, from the government. I used to work for 6 years for US EPA in the Clean Air Markets Division that did the acid rain trading program, and I worked on the international programs working with Mexico and with the CEC. And I just wanted to make a couple comments and also a question for each of you. Michelle, in your discussion about the CEC, I think perhaps another couple things to look at are the interaction within the U.S. agencies in terms of the view of the CEC. For example, NAFTA giving EPA the lead agency in that treaty is unique, and it leads to a lot of power asymmetries within the U.S. government, especially with the burr that creates at State Department of not being in charge. And so I think that's an important piece of the regional institutional development, as well as the kind of historical institutional path within the CEC of the change in the Bush administration and its view on climate change, and the fact that the CEC kept on trucking and did not incorporate that into their views. That lost a lot of capital for the CEC, especially within the U.S. government. And CEC was seen as out of step with the U.S. government. Finally, on that, I wanted to talk about the issue of the air quality. You portrayed it as sometimes problematic if you connect to air quality. And I wanted to perhaps make the case that air quality is perhaps the way forward in these institutional development, and wanted to ask you to comment on that, especially with the active interaction in the U.S.-Canada Air Quality Agreement and the discussions about how trading could work along, especially the eastern border, and the problems and institutional problems that would create. And I'll wrap up here because I know this is becoming more comments than questions. But I wanted to ask Simone about your question or your portrayal of Mexico as a close follower in their, for example, Pemex moving forward.
Pemex, not Mexico as a whole. Pemex,
Okay.
that company.
But that Pemex moving forward as a close follower, and I think that the Bush administration did a big favor to international relations scholars in creating an experimental treatment to the international system. Because in this case, I think in my own research in comparing Mexico and India, perhaps you see this in terms of international politics, rather than being a follower, is the aspiring leader. A lot of the people that I worked with in Mexico really wanted Mexico to be a leader within Latin America, especially leading Central America. And now you see the connections between Mexico and Europe aligning more with the seen as the anti-U.S. or the non-U.S. Groups of Mexico signing, for example, agreements with Spain. And you see the similar thing with India, that India is now courting favor within the EU, and you see virtually a 180 turn in its climate policy at the same time that India is trying to get a seat on the Security Council, etc. So I think there's a international politics dynamic as well that's circling around the North American dynamic. Thank you.
Michelle, there's a lot there. I think
Okay.
answer this first and we'll go on.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your comments, and I want to follow up with you afterwards. I think excellent points about looking at the internal dynamics of the interagency, essentially as that it creates in the U.S. to have the EPA be the lead agency in the CEC. I sense that just further reinforces the idea of the CEC as being this weak institution and really not having capacity to facilitate any sort of coordination on the issue of reducing CO2 emissions. And yeah, it's just, that's a problem. I mean, it just doesn't have the credibility, it doesn't have the strength, there's just not a foundation there for it to really be a facilitative institution. I don't know anything about the SPP that Joe talks about, but that might be interesting to see what opportunities are there and if that might be a better foothold. Yeah, the air quality as the way forward. Somebody mentioned earlier but I had done a project looking at cities and climate change, and the thing that was so striking to me, and Barry Ray alluded to this, over and over I was talking to cities that were portrayed as leaders on climate change, but nobody would talk about climate change, right? This is all about economic development, this is all about air quality, this is, all these other things. And I wrote something at one point that said the best way forward on climate change is to not talk about climate change. And I still think that politically makes sense, but I'm kind of backtracking. I'm saying that makes sense, but there may be trade-offs. And I think there are possible synergies that could be exploited in the linkages between air quality and climate mitigation. But those are political choices, and that they aren't necessarily mutually reinforcing, and that if we're serious about climate, that has to be part of the discussion. And so you look for opportunities to make sure that there are synergies and avoid places where they counteract one another. So that's where I am on that discussion.
Great question. I want to make sure I'm making a distinction between Pemex and Mexico as a leader, right? So Pemex within the international oil industry cannot be a leader, and they recognize that, right? They don't have the technical capacity, they don't have sort of expertise, so that's why they see themselves as a close follower. However, at the regional level, they do see themselves as a leader, right? So they're doing sort of workshops through ARPEL, which is a regional association, and I was at a conference just recently, and someone was telling me actually that she had been invited to do a briefing for the folks at Saudi Aramco on climate change. So I think it also potentially sees itself as a leader among state-owned oil companies. And then sort of Mexico, I completely agree about the international politics dimension of this. I mean, Mexico is a fascinating place, and in part its relationship to the U.S., and I mean, similar to Canada, right? Like, needs to define itself as separate from the U.S., different from the U.S. Because one of the questions I asked is, why BP and not ExxonMobil? You could make an argument that ExxonMobil is a leader in the oil industry, maybe not on the climate change issue, but in other ways, right? Widely recognized as the best run company out there. And Mexico is not a member of OPEC, right? So also very, it has issues of national self-identity that, are important issues. And I do think that it, if you're speaking about Mexico, not Pemex, there are all these sort of creating an identity independent of the U.S. So through linkages with Europe, through linkages with Japan also, that's a key part of what's going on.
Okay. Stacey? Hold on. I'm sorry.
I guess two questions. Michelle, I thought your reasons to be skeptical of the CEC are convincing, and I really liked the paper and the talk. But I also thought that yesterday and today there are a whole bunch of reasons to think that NAFTA cooperation in general, and potentially the CEC as one venue for it on some of these issues, is unlikely to sort of be able to ignore these energy and climate and interdependence issues as we go forward. So one of the things I wondered how you felt about that sort of notion of where things would go and whether or not you saw it. It seems to me that potentially NAFTA body's role may be to respond to coming challenges of the kind that have been listed for 2 days, rather than likely to be positing the new system for continental politics, right? So I wondered how you felt about that. And Joe, thank you very much for your comments. I guess my general skepticism, I know very little about the SDP at all, but my sense is that if I was a state official or if I was doing energy work, I can't imagine wanting to be involved in any such effort, because it strikes me as the rational application of policymaking to energy strikes me as so hopeless that it's hard to imagine, right, why it would be the case that I would dedicate more of my already really scarce time to an endeavor. I feel like I would be so hard to convince that this is going to matter a lick in anything that actually happens in this town in particular.
Hi, Lauren Faber from the British Embassy. My question is for Simone. I was just wondering if, historically, you're noting this oscillation in interest in the issue of climate change. If you've seen any impact or upsurge in interest given the invitation of Mexico to participate in the G8+5 Gleneagles Dialogue and the next ministerial to take place in Mexico, if that has had any sort of positive impact, or if you've noticed anything, any fallout at all.
Okay, we'll take those two for right now.
So I have to be full disclosure. I have not been a close follower of these issues lately. So there might be others, actually, Joe and others in the room, who would be better able to speak to this. I mean, I think that sort of those, in some ways, micro events, have a certain effect on sort of a minor oscillation, but I think there's sort of deep, more structural barriers that mean that no, ultimately not a large upswing would be my.
I appreciate your skepticism. I might express similar skepticism about some of the other avenues that have been talked about over the past couple of days. I think this could work. I wouldn't assign probabilities to it. But the reason I think it could work is because the national leaders are committed to it. I think it's significant that that NAWAG and SPP kept working right through the Canadian election. And as a matter of fact, they issued one of their most important documents before Stephen Harper took office. I think that there is a vested interest that has nothing to do with global climate change on the part of both the Canadian and the U.S. leaders in keeping Mexico on the reservation in this respect. I think it will carry through even if López Obrador is elected. I think it will take off like a bird if Felipe Calderón, who is leading in some polls now, is brought in. But the fact is, although there has been this invitation from the national leaders through their cabinet ministers to ask for stakeholder input, there simply hasn't been stakeholder input. Now, the bureaucrats who actually control things at the ministerial level as well as farther down have not been anxious to bring stakeholders in, except on a selective basis. There have been maybe 7 or 8 workshops that a lot of people, even in the industry, didn't know were taking place. So I would again repeat the electronic address www.spp.gov. Take a look at it. There's an opportunity to make an input. Well, there are what, 30, 35 people left here? If 10% of them sent emails to say anything, I think the people who run that website would be amazed. And I think it would have an effect.
Can I speak to Stacy's question really quickly? I guess your question is, so am I saying there's no role for NAFTA or continental-wide coordination? And that's not at all what I mean to say. As one IR scholar to another, we've tended always to think that hierarchy is good, right? As you develop institutions at higher levels, it somehow will pull everything together and we can solve the world's problems. And I'm increasingly, like most people at this conference, see the issue of climate change as something that can't be solved at any single sphere or tier of governance, but it requires coordination. And so the question then is to kind of parse out what are the things that can be done in different spheres and tiers in a way that reinforces what's happening in places around it. And so, I come away saying a NAFTA-wide CEC-based emissions trading system does not, in fact, complement and reinforce things that are being done in other spheres and tiers of governance. It might actually contradict those. So that's not the role for NAFTA. But I think some of the things that Joe's talking about of making the link between energy and climate, those might be some of the things we might explore, and that would be more, perhaps more beneficial, and again, contributing to this overall coordination of multi-level governance. So.
Thank you. A question, I guess, which could be directed towards Ian and Joe. And Joe, I like the raincoat metaphor. And just to carry that one step further, it's often argued, for example, that reliance on Middle Eastern oil raises security issues, which we've seen play out. Reduce that reliance, increase security, or rather reduce vulnerability to risk in the United States. And so I guess my question would be, can we bring security into this discussion? It seems to me that risk vulnerability with electricity supply, for example, on a large-scale grid, is an obvious point that we have to keep in mind. Not just in terms of vulnerability to terrorist attack or what have you. I mean, that's the most obvious example, but reliance on it in particular increases or I should say, reduces the foreign policy options, perhaps, that a state has. And how would you bring security into this discussion? I mean, by the way, the SPP Does it deal with security? That would be an issue. A question I would. It doesn't. Okay.
It does. It's called the Security and Prosperity
Right.
Partnership.
I know. But I'm wondering, how does it deal with security more explicitly?
Okay. I think there are 9 or 10 working groups under the prosperity part, and they are coordinated by the Department of Commerce in the United States. The 3 or 4 working groups that have to do with security are coordinated by our Department of Homeland Security. I can't tell you exactly what the division is in Canada and Mexico, but there is that breakdown.
Okay, that'd be something interesting.
And infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is not under the prosperity part. It has been moved over taken out away from NAWAG and given to the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay, I'll just open it up. Can we bring security into this discussion?
Barry?
Much of this discussion, appropriately so, has focused on the electricity sector, and that's only about a third of continental greenhouse gases. I'm curious your sense from each of your perspectives of the roles of different institutions or even cross-unit collaboration in the transportation sector, methane, agriculture, the whole basket of non-electricity areas that still comprise the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in all 3 countries, and whether you see any activity there or if there's just something so unique to electricity that's going to be the dominant area for cross-boundary collaboration.
Okay, we'll take those 2.
I'll start. Peter, the notion of security and when you talk about bringing security into this to a greater extent, 2 thoughts come to mind. I guess one, which I think you perhaps alluded to, I'll say it more explicitly. The movement in an energy future, we were talking earlier about visions and how perhaps positive visions can move us more constructively than simply images of fear. The vision that some put out in this debate about moving from a large centralized power plants and long-distance transmission grids to something that is much more dispersed and diversified, where you have a number of different, not only load points, but supply points as well, be that smaller wind farms, be that solar panels on the roof and the such, would suggest to me the potential for increasing security in that way, where you have much more of a diversity, a cobweb, if you like, whereby if you have a particular problem in one area, there can be different routes that are established where it can be addressed much more quickly. Whereas if you have a system that is reliant upon a smaller number of supply centers, that one particular brink can have much more catastrophic impacts for security. And I guess the other thought, the comment made earlier about how this can nevertheless cut both ways, is something I'm cognizant of as well. Though not knowing the figures exactly, I know if you look at reserves to production ratios on fossil fuels in North America, coal looks very positive in that way. And if you're thinking about, security means indigenous supply, I'm not saying it does, but if it's interpreted in that way, it can send us in a different kind of direction. And then just the other comment about Barry's, about the role of different institutions and so on. My focus has been upon electricity, and that is not because it's the be-all, end-all, and will be the one that is solely dominant and important, except very much that these other areas you're talking about will be significant as well. Nothing in particular to add, sort of illuminating, saying that institution X or Y will be particularly significant, but obviously the debate about other forms of energy exports, natural gas in particular, from north to south in this continent, and obviously transport corridors, which often are north to south as well in other elements there. There's a great potential for looking at addressing climate change through those other avenues.
Let me expand a little bit about cross-border cooperation in both electricity and in fossil fuels. The blackout was mentioned, August 2003. I think that could have produced a tornado in itself along the Canadian border had it not been for the mutual understanding that had been taught by the North American Energy Working Group and by something called the North American Electric Reliability Council. The Electric Reliability Council addresses the electric grid in regions rather than in states and provinces, and there's overlapping. Now, it was toothless until August of last year, when the new so-called comprehensive national energy legislation was passed in this country. It said we're going to let FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, enforce the decisions that are reached by this essentially non-governmental or tri-governmental organization. And of course, FERC can only act within the United States, but Canada has been moving right along to find ways of enforcing decisions by NERC. In respect to and the reason I think there wasn't hell to pay over the blackout was that they actually studied the issue instead of pointing accusing fingers, except for a few politicians. In fossil fuel, the regulators from Canada, the energy regulators from Canada, the United States, and Mexico have been meeting through their senior staffs 3 times a year for the past 5 years. They talk about harmonizing regulation, not homogenizing regulation, but at least they anticipate problems that are going to arise in one or another part of North America. And one of the problems they realized is that we're going to have a real natural gas crunch. Now, why should climate change people be interested in having enough natural gas on the continent? Because natural gas is responsible for 50% less emissions of carbon dioxide than is coal when burned to produce electricity. As I can't say as a direct result, but as an adjunct of this kind of activity, LNG facilities are being built in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and this gas is going to feed into a truly continental natural gas pipeline system.
Follow up on this as well. I mean, one fun fact that I mentioned in the paper and not in the talk is that Pemex's annual emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from its process, are equivalent to Ireland's, right? So there are, and this, this is oil company process emissions, right? Methane and all the different emissions associated with that sort of that particular industry. So there's that. I mean, and then of course the other area where there is a lot of activities in transportation, simply because air pollution is an issue that has historically been such a problem, particularly in Mexico City, and there's been so much sort of institutional capacity built around that. So I know that actually, once again, with WRI, there's a lots of innovative collaborations there around sustainable transport, and so I think that's a really promising sector as well in Mexico.
Following directly up on that, for various reasons, I've only focused on electricity as well. But just kind of, exploring around the CEC website, there has been work on transport, and I think that has to do with air sheds. Cross-border air sheds are kind of a mechanism for thinking about collaboration, and so that raises transportation issues, that raises air quality issues, and so I think that's also being addressed in the CEC.
Well, thank you very much. Good questions, good presentations. It's not over yet because I think there's still some things that we need to talk about with each other, but we've got sandwiches outside. Grab one, grab someone to eat with, ask them questions. It's been delightful to have you here. The presenters, thank you very much for your papers, for getting them in on time and so we could all read them beforehand. We look forward to reading any revisions you have. We'll post them at our website. I want to thank the Environmental Change and Security Program here, and to the Canadian Embassy and the Energy Foundation, and to other folks who got here on their own steam. Most appreciative. Thank you, and thank Stacy and Henrik for their coordination on this. Jeff, anything you want to add?
No, it's tremendous. It's been wonderful, and we hope you will follow up with these particular papers and these particular people in the discussions here, and then also continue to take advantage of the Wilson Center in trying to facilitate these kinds of dialogue on climate, as pick up some of these save the date notices for a reception next week on Tuesday, and then this meeting in July. We hope you'll continue to take advantage of the discussions here. So thank you very, very much.